This podcast is a ministry of the First Baptist Church of Diana, Texas. If you're in East Texas, you can gather with us on Sundays at 10:15 a.m. You can find more episodes of our podcast on iTunes, Spotify, and on our website, www.fbcdiana.org. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Josh. Would you all turn in your Bibles with me to Revelation chapter 18? Revelation 18. We're picking back up on our series through the book of Revelation after our short pause through the month of October for our series on some of the Reformation recoveries of the solas, as they're called, the alones. But today we're diving back into Revelation. And what an interesting passage we'll be getting right back into this morning as we jump into it. If you have ever watched a good movie or read a good novel, then you probably know what it's like to wait with eager anticipation for the villain to get it and for the good guy to give it to him. Who is not moved when Mel Gibson's character, a gritty American revolutionary, finally faces down Colonel Tavington in The Patriot? Who doesn't feel a sense of satisfaction when Wyatt Earp chases all of the cowboys and gives them what's coming to them? Especially when Doc Holliday puts away Johnny Ringo so sarcastically. And for the nerdier folks among us, who isn't inspired when Aragorn leads a cavalry charge just before dawn when all seems lost in order to break Sauron's horde and to defend Helm's Deep? Some of the worst movies and stories are those where the producer or the author wants to leave us with the impression that the good guys actually lose, that the detective does not find his man, that the underdogs are destroyed in the big game or in the big battle. Think of Thanos at the end of Infinity War, basking in his victory. But the best stories are those where the good guys faced what appears to be inevitable loss. The detective seems to have no more good leads, and the underdogs look like they have absolutely no reason to hope for victory, and yet somehow they pull it off in the end. I think there's a reason that stories like this naturally resonate with us. There is something about that kind of story that touches a fundamental or visceral aspect of our humanity. We deeply want good to triumph. We want justice done. We want villains defeated, and we want the wicked to receive justice. For the last several chapters of the book of Revelation, we've been reading about the apparent triumph of the villain and the expected suffering of those who are on the side of the hero. After the 7 seals of the apocalyptic scroll there in Revelation 6 and 7, and after the 7 blasts of the heavenly trumpets in chapter 8 through 11, all of this is assuring the reader that both God's final judgment and his complete salvation is coming. And after these descriptions, we land ourselves in chapter 12, where we're reminded of a different set of features for this unfolding story. Yes, God's salvation and his judgment are coming, but before that final end, there's going to be much suffering, and even what appears to be defeat for the kingdom of Christ in this world. And we have seen and read about these features before in Revelation, but they, at least in my understanding, they're amplified in chapters 12 and 13. These chapters seem to describe what I think is the entire span of history from Christ's first coming to his second. And of course, sometimes it's going to look better, and sometimes it's going to look worse, but the unfolding story of redemption and of final glorification, well, it travels right through the path of worldly opposition. The dragon will rage with fury, chapters 12 and 13 teach us. There will be powerful and deceptive and compelling beasts on the loose, especially there in Revelation 13. And they will wreak havoc on the people who love and trust and follow the Lamb. Think even of the symbolic figure leaders of each of these two groups as the story progresses. The earth dwellers, that is the unrepentant and rebellious sinners, And the demonic armies, well, their leader is a violent and bloodthirsty dragon. He's their king. But those who are the servants of God, the people of Christ, the faithful and believing ones, their leader, their king, is a slain lamb. Revelation 14 reminded us yet again that the victory is sure for the Lamb and for his people. Revelation chapters 15 and 16 described God's judgment and salvation once again with 7 bowls or 7 plagues as we read about them there. And in that last cycle of 7, we learned the name of the earthly kingdom that embodies all that the dragon stands for. This earthly kingdom is called Babylon. And she, Babylon, represents not just one wicked kingdom, but all of the nations of the earth. There is a sense in which every worldly kingdom has and will continue to set itself over against the Lord Jesus Christ. And insofar as earthly kingdoms do that, they are outposts or colonies of Babylon, the mother of all earth's abominations. A couple of Sundays ago, Josh Tanner preached through Revelation 17, and he highlighted the walking contradiction that is the great Babylon. She's attractive, she seems invincible, she even rides upon the devilish beast. But as Josh rightly pointed out a couple of Sundays ago, the whole point of Revelation 17 is that the greatness of Babylon is only superficial, it's only skin deep, and it's only temporary. It's deceptive and it won't last. She will be utterly destroyed, and so will all who throw in their lot with her. So our passage today then is something like the beginning of the end for Babylon and for the dragon, those great villains who have taken up their banner of hostility toward Christ and toward his people. There is a glorious and an authoritative messenger from heaven that proclaims the fall of Babylon in our passage. He describes the reasons for the fall of Babylon, and he outlines the comprehensive and meticulous justice of the whole thing. It is right and just that God would set his hard hand against Babylon in this way. The final and ultimate victory of Christ and his people is still yet to come from our perspective of history. But in Revelation 18, that final announcement in the prophetic storyline of the unfolding chapters of Revelation, that day has come. This is what Revelation 18 tells us. God has remembered Babylon's sins, and he has come to pay her back in full. The villain gets it. But what are we to do with this news? How are we to live in light of that news today and in light of the coming day? Well, there are a whole bunch of ways we might answer such a question, but I think our chapter calls us, at least in one way, to answer questions like these. What do we do with this? How are we to live? Let's consider all of Revelation 18 together this morning. And would you mind standing with me one more time as we read our chapter together? Revelation chapter 18, starting with verse 1, and I'll read through the end of the chapter. After this, I saw another angel coming down from heaven, having great authority, and the earth was made bright with his glory. And he called out with a mighty voice, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become a dwelling place for demons, a haunt for every unclean spirit, a haunt for every unclean bird, a haunt for every unclean and detestable beast. For all nations have drunk the wine of her passions, of the passions of her sexual immorality. And the kings of the earth have committed immorality with her. And the merchants of the earth have grown rich from her power, from the power of her luxurious living. Then I heard another voice from heaven saying, 'Come out of her, my people, lest you take part in her sins, lest you share in her plagues. For her sins are heaped high as heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities. Pay her back as she herself has paid back others, and repay her double for her deeds. Mix a double portion for her in the cup she has mixed. As she glorified herself and lived in luxury, so give her a like measure of torment and mourning. Since in her heart she says, I sit as queen. I am no widow, and mourning I shall never see. For this reason her plagues will come in a single day, death and mourning and famine, and she will be burned up with fire. For mighty is the Lord God, who has judged her. And the kings of the earth, who committed sexual immorality and lived in luxury with her, will weep and wail over her when they see the smoke of her burning. They will stand far off in fear of her torment and say, Alas, alas, you great city, you mighty city Babylon, for in a single hour your judgment has come. And the merchants of the earth weep and mourn for her, since no one buys their cargo anymore. Cargo of gold, silver, jewels, pearls, fine linen, purple cloth, silk, scarlet cloth, all kinds of scented wood, all kinds of articles of ivory, all kinds of articles of costly wood, bronze, iron, and marble, cinnamon, spice, incense, myrrh, frankincense, wine, oil, fine flour, wheat, cattle and sheep, horses and chariots, and slaves, that is, human souls. The fruit for which your soul longed has gone from you, and all your delicacies and your splendors are lost to you, never to be found again. The merchants of these wares who gained wealth from her will stand far off in fear of her torment, weeping and mourning aloud. Alas, alas, for the great city that was clothed in fine linen, in purple and scarlet, adorned with gold, with jewels, and with pearls. For in a single hour all this wealth has been laid waste. And all shipmasters and seafaring men, sailors and those who trade on the sea, stood far off and cried out as they saw the smoke of her burning. What city was like the great city? And they threw dust on their heads as they wept and mourned, crying out, Alas, alas, for the great city where all who had ships at sea grew rich by her wealth. For in a single hour she has been laid waste. Rejoice over her, O heaven, and you saints and apostles and prophets, for God has given judgment for you against her. Then a mighty angel took up a stone like a great millstone and threw it into the sea, saying, So will Babylon, the great city, be thrown down with violence, and will be found no more. And the sound of harpists and musicians, of flute players and trumpets will be heard in you no more. And a craftsman of any craft will be found in you no more. And the sound of the mill will be heard in you no more. And the light of a lamp will shine in you no more. And the voice of bridegroom and bride will be heard in you no more. For your merchants were the great ones of the earth, and all nations were deceived by your sorcery. And in her was found the blood of prophets and of saints, and all who have been slain on the earth. Thank you, God, for your word. You can all be seated. Aiming for this to be an expositional sermon, not a topical one. So starting with the text, trying to draw out from it what I understand to be the main point of this passage. I've tried to summarize that by saying that the kingdoms of this earth will soon face the swift and complete judgment of God. Therefore, we ought to separate ourselves by living faithfully for Christ in anticipation of that day. Swift and complete judgment is coming. Therefore, we ought to separate ourselves, living faithfully for Christ in anticipation of that coming day. We'll basically just follow the structure as I see it of this passage here. We'll look at two announcements from heaven. We'll see three earthly laments that are spoken from those of the earth. One description of the totality of God's judgment. And then we'll circle back and hear what I think is the main takeaway of our passage this morning, which is the heavenly call for separation. So let's look first at verses 1 to 3 and read about this first heavenly announcement. So after John saw the picture of seduction and power and brutality, that great and blasphemous woman of Revelation 17, this woman Babylon, and after John heard that her destruction was soon to come there in Revelation 17, well, now he hears and sees another heavenly vision which announces that the day of her destruction has come. It's here. And this first announcement in verses 1 to 3 is a kind of summary of the whole chapter, as I understand it. And John says in verse 1 that he saw another angel coming down from heaven. He describes this angel as one who has great authority and one whose glory made the earth bright. You see it there in verse 1. The earth was made bright by his glory. This heavenly messenger, I think, is very likely Christ himself, since every other description in Revelation of glory refers to God or Christ. And it is also fitting that Christ himself, he would be the one to announce this victory over the great city in opposition to him. He is, after all, the Lord of lords and the King of kings. And he is well able to make his own announcements. Whatever you think of who this messenger is, either an angelic authoritative messenger from heaven or the risen and glorified Christ himself making this announcement, either way, this heavenly announcement comes and the messenger cries out with a mighty voice, verse 2, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great." In other words, there is no more delay. The day has come. The midnight hour has arrived. Verses 2 to 3 describe Babylon's condition at the time of her destruction. So the announcement is, all is over, it is time, the day has come. But what is Babylon like at that time? Well, verse 2 says she has become a dwelling place for demons, a haunt for all kinds of unclean things. Verse 3 says that all nations have joined in with her in some sense, that they have drunk the wine of the passion of her sexual immorality. This includes, we're told in verse 3, both the kings and the merchants of the earth. Both civil and economic powers have joined in other words, with the beastly woman. And note the tandem realities here. The kings, the merchants of the earth, they have benefited from their relationship with this Jezebel-type woman. They have been able to drink themselves drunk on the wine of her immorality. Wine is often a blessing in the Bible, a sign of blessing. Only victorious and powerful people or nations have the kind of peace and prosperity that's necessary to produce such lavish non-essentials like wine. Only a nation with peace is able to produce this with wealth and stability. But these successful kings, these successful merchants, as they are described here, with a surplus of all good things, wine being the symbol of such a thing, well, they dwell right alongside demons and all sorts of unclean things there in verse 2. In the Bible, sexual immorality and idolatry are so closely related that the two are nearly synonymous. It seems that a rejection of God as King and Lord is demonstrated in no greater way than the throwing off of sexual restraints, the destruction of the institution of marriage, and the use of fellow image bearers as mere instruments for my own sexual pleasure. Note the tandem realities that at the height of their wealth and power, these kings and merchants with Babylon, so too is it described as a demonic place that's haunted with all kinds of unclean things. Friends, civil power and economic success and sexual pleasure, these are not bad things in and of themselves. For example, God has instituted civil structures for society, including government and the power and authority that it wields. And God has written the protection of private property into the basic summary of his moral law. Consider the 8th commandment. So too, he has told us that honest and diligent work, that this is fundamental and good for us. And God has also instituted marriage for our good. He's intended us, husbands and wives, to enjoy one another in the relationship of marriage. These things are not bads in and of themselves. But, brothers and sisters, when these good things become the goal, when they become an end in themselves, then those who pursue such things as an end in themselves become like the kings and the merchants described in our passage, drunk, as it were, on immorality. And in this world, with all its pleasures, These kinds of things are naturally enticing to us. Some of us are enticed by the invitation to worldly power. We want a seat at the table, and we could think of a relatively small table or a big table, but we want a seat there. And we might make all sorts of compromises to get there. It's enticing to us. Some of us are enticed by worldly wealth. We want entertainment, we want luxuries, and we might be willing to speak and act in dishonest and cruel ways in order to get them. Some of us are enticed by sexual pleasure. We want to fulfill our brute desires, and we are inclined to do it. If we're honest with ourselves for 3 seconds or more, we will be able to clearly confess that we are enticed by one or more of these worldly pleasures. But the call here is to don't be fooled. On the very day that Babylon seems so strong and so luxurious, so indulgent in all sorts of unclean or sinful activity, that is the very day when the announcement will ring out. Fallen. Fallen is Babylon the Great. As I said, this first heavenly announcement is something of a summary of our whole passage, but let's look now to the second heavenly announcement there in verses 4 to 8. The second one includes a call for separation, which I think is the main takeaway for our passage today. So like I said, I'll circle back to that in the final point of my sermon. But right now, I'd like us to focus on the swiftness of God's judgment and even the rationale that's given for it here in this portion of our text this morning. So note the swiftness there, especially in verse 8. John says that he heard another voice from heaven, verse 4. And this one said, verse 8, that her plagues, that is the plagues from God that fell on Babylon, will come in a single day. Even the kings and the merchants and the seafaring men that we'll read about shortly in verses 9 to 20, even they are amazed by the suddenness of God's judgment. They all three say, verse 10, in a single hour your judgment has come. Verse 17, in a single hour all the wealth has been laid waste. Verse 19, in a single hour she, Babylon herself, has been laid waste. And verse 8 also tells us that it is the Lord God who has judged her. God himself has burned her up with fire. Friends, God has promised never to destroy the earth again by water, which he did in Noah's day. You can read about that in Genesis chapter 6 to 9. But the Bible teaches us that the day of the Lord will come like a thief, 2 Peter chapter 3. That is, it will be surprising in its swiftness. And then, as 2 Peter chapter 3 continues on, then the heavens will pass away with a roar, and the heavenly bodies will be burned up and dissolved. And the earth and the works that are done on it will be exposed. When God's fiery judgment finally comes, it will be swift. This is an emphasis of our passage today, and is certainly emphasized throughout the Bible. Most of this second announcement, though, in verses 4 to 8, is the rationale. It provides the reason for the judgment of God coming in its swiftness and totality. See it there in verse 5. Her, Babylon's, sins are heaped as high as heaven. It is as though the Bible is emphasizing for us here that the sin odometer has gotten high enough, where finally God has had enough. Verse 6 says that she herself has paid condemnation and judgment to others, so she is to be paid back for such things. She's dished out, and so now the time has come for her to receive. Verse 7 says that she glorified herself and lived in luxury, honoring herself, the leaders and economic forces, influencers of Babylon, all the worldly kingdoms, making a name for themselves, almost an echo of the Tower of Babel at the beginning of the biblical story narrative. Even to such a degree that verse 7 says that she says in her heart, I sit as queen. I'm the ruler. I am no widow. I am not barren, but instead I am prolific. And mourning I shall never see. Good shall follow me all the days of my life, says the leaders of Babylon. But verse 8 tells us, for this reason. The heavenly messenger announces, for this very reason, her plagues will come in a single day. Not only will the totality of God's judgment be just and right and appropriate, but even at the very height of appearance of strength and wealth that Babylon has, the swiftness of God's judgment and the ability for God to wipe it out in a single swipe. This is right and good. 4 verse 5, God has remembered her iniquities, her sins. Heaven demands, even verse 6, God's righteousness demands, pay her back and mix a double portion for her in the cup that she has mixed. Friends, every individual sinner will face God's swift and righteous judgment on the last day. But what our passage today is reminding us of is that so too will the whole world of sinners face God's judgment on the last day. In a collective way, God also will dole out his judgment. In the same way that individual sinners live rebellious lives, rejecting God's commands, denying Christ's authority, and mocking Christ's people, so those same sinners join together in civil institutions, in community organizations, in big business, in sinners' conglomerates, sinners' unions, as it were. Rebellion against God is the effect. Rejection of Christ is the effect. And persecution of Christ's people is the effect in a communal way, in a corporate way. And on the last day, God will mix a double portion in his cup of wrath. And sinners will all, individually and collectively, drink it to the dregs. This is the announcement that we hear. We also hear in our passage 3 earthly laments. We'll see that in verses 9 to 20. This is point number 3 of the sermon now. Those 3 earthly laments. We hear one from the kings of the earth, one from the merchants of the earth, one from seafaring men. It seems that seafaring men kind of belongs as sort of a subcategory of the merchants, but either way, we hear these 3 refrains. They're all devastated by the destruction of the great city, that city that once gave them such power and luxury. As verse 14 says, the fruit for which their soul longed has gone out from them, and all delicacies and splendors are lost, never to be found again. Their response then is a response of lament. This whole section is full of lament on the part of the earth dwellers, those who have made their home in the kingdom of Babylon, those who have enjoyed the worldly benefits and have trampled underfoot the kingdom and the people of Christ. There are those on the last day who will mourn the loss of this kingdom that sets itself up against God and Christ. But there's also another group here who is called to respond to Babylon's destruction, and they are actually called to rejoice. Let's look first at the laments and then at the rejoicing. These 3 laments, we see the first one coming up there in verse 10, is described in verse 9 as the kings of the earth, those who committed sexual immorality and lived in luxury with Babylon. They will weep and wail over her when they see the smoke of her burning, and here is their cry. Alas, alas, you great city, you mighty city Babylon. Alas. The merchants of the earth then, we're told in verse 12, they weep and mourn for her since no one buys their cargo anymore. Verse 15 tells us that they're the ones who gained wealth from her, and they will stand weeping and mourning aloud. They too will cry out, alas, alas, verse 16, for the great city that was clothed and adorned with beauty and with wealth. They are sad to see her go. And finally, in verses 17 to 19, we see that all shipmasters and seafaring men, sailors, and those whose trade is on the sea, they too cry out as they see the smoke of her burning. And they say, verse 18, what city was like the great city? Verse 19, here they go with their lament. Alas, alas, for the great city where all who had ships at sea grew rich by her wealth. Friends, again, note the tandem realities on display. Note the emphasis on the power and wealth of Babylon, even as Babylon is being destroyed. She seemed so mighty, so prosperous. It seemed that nothing would overthrow the great city. But God's judgment will come, and Babylon will be laid waste or destroyed in a single hour. For those who make their home in Babylon, there will be nothing but lament and mourning on the last day. Mourning about what is in store, but also mourning for what has been lost. But for those whose home is the heavenly city, they will rejoice. In fact, they're called to do so. See it there in verse 20 of our passage. This section of lament by all of the earth dwellers, the ones who've made their home in Babylon. It is completed with what seems to be sort of peppered throughout our passage, yet more statements coming from the heavenly voice. Rejoice over her, verse 20, O heaven, and you saints and apostles and prophets. For what reason should they rejoice? Why ought there be rejoicing at such a terrible display of God's judgment? Well, for God has given judgment for you against her. Well, this speaks again of the vindication that God will give to all his people on the last day. Remember the prayers of the saints back there in Revelation chapter 6. We're told about these saints who have died. They have been killed because of their faith and their witness, and they are under the altar in this heavenly vision that John sees, and they cry out with a loud voice, Revelation chapter 6, verse 10, O sovereign Lord, holy and true, how long before you will judge and avenge our blood on those who dwell on the earth? And they're told there in Revelation chapter 6, verse 11, rest a little longer until the number of their fellow servants and brothers should be complete. It is as though more faithful ones must die, but God's judgment will come. And indeed, this is what Revelation 18 is telling us, is that God sees the suffering of his people, and he will judge sinners on the last day in a display of judgment that will vindicate all those who remained faithful to Christ. The faithful ones may suffer in this life, sometimes brutally, and sometimes less so, but they most definitely will rejoice in the end and in the life to come. A passage full of lament, but also of rejoicing for the vindication of God's people. That was point number 3. Let's turn now to point 2, the description of this total judgment in verses 21 to 24. I want to notice the finality and the totality of God's judgment that's emphasized here. We see a picture on display. Many symbols have been presented to us throughout Revelation. And here again, John sees this heavenly messenger with a millstone that is thrown into the sea. Then the angel, the mighty angel, says there in verse 21, so will Babylon, the great city, be thrown down with violence. This picks up on imagery of Old Testament prophets like Jeremiah and Ezekiel. And Jesus also uses this imagery during his earthly ministry. You might remember it there in Matthew chapter 18, where Jesus warns that anyone who would cause another to sin would face a punishment so severe that it would be better for him, Jesus says, to have a great millstone fastened around his neck and to be drowned in the depth of the sea. Jesus went on to say, Matthew chapter 18, verse 7, the next bit there, woe to the world for temptations to sin. Woe is the pronouncement of judgment, and the world itself experiences judgment because temptation to sin is there. So the beckoning, the invitation to head towards sin and disobedience, that in itself is a judgment being proclaimed with Jesus' words. Then he goes on to say, still there in Matthew chapter 18, verse 7, for it is necessary that temptations come. This is the way the world is going to go for a while. But Jesus says, woe to the one by whom the temptations come. Woe to the one by whom the temptation comes. There is a sense in which God not only judges sinners in the world for the sin that they have committed, but also for the part each sinner played in perpetuating the whole worldly system that celebrates, that encourages, that normalizes sin. Note even the rationale of our passage here this morning in verses 23 and 24. For, why is it that judgment has come? For your, Babylon's merchants, were the great ones of the earth. They were the ones in leadership. Those are the ones with influence. They're the ones with the power to set and to change societal norms. And what was the result of their leadership, influence, their societal hand? All the nations were deceived or led astray by your sorcery, verse 23. It is as though many of the cultural and political and economic leaders of this world use spells or trickery or magic to sway the whole of society towards sin and ungodly rebellion. It is as though as spiritual, as political and as economic and as societal leaders go, so too does the society tend to follow towards sin, toward ungodly rebellion. And God will one day judge those who use their influence in this way. Another reason is there in verse 24 for the total destruction that's coming to Babylon. Not only because Babylon itself was rebellious against God, not only because Babylon itself encouraged everyone who was a citizen of Babylon to also be rebellious against God, but also because Babylon persecuted and killed those who stood in the way. See it there in verse 24. In her was found the blood of the prophets and the saints. And this poetic and prophetic imagery, it speaks to the fact that those who press for more sin and rebellion, they often destroy the ones who stand in the way of progress. And so when the righteous ones say, wait, don't, that's bad. Those get crushed under the machine of Babylon, the societal and civil and economic machine that very often not only promotes sin, but persecutes and punishes the righteous who stand in the way. Note here the totality of the destruction. There's a rhythm at the end of our passage of no more. It's repeated again and again. See it there in verses 22 and 23. 6 times in these 3 verses, 21, 22, 23, the heavenly messenger says no more. God's judgment on Babylon will be final and total. And think of all the various aspects of society that are mentioned as well. So verse 22 says musicians will be heard no more. No more singing or celebrations. Craftsmen will be found in you no more. No more building or construction. The sound of the mill will be heard in you no more. No production or economy. The light of the lamp will shine in you no more. No light of life or knowledge. The voice of the bridegroom and bride will be heard in you no more. No more marriage, which is the basic institution of civilization itself. In sum, verse 21, Babylon, the great city, will be found no more. Friends, the kingdoms of this earth, represented by Babylon, will soon face swift and complete judgment from God himself. One day it will be the end of the world as we know it, and no one will feel fine. It will be the opposite of fine. Some will look upon the destruction of this world with sorrow and mourning because all that they enjoyed has come to an end. Others will look upon the destruction of this world and they will be able to, in fact, called to rejoice and praise because the true king has vindicated his people and delivered justice on those who oppressed and despised them for so long. Okay, but what do we do with this news? We have seen, we've read this reminder so much here in chapter 18 of Revelation. How are Christians to live in light of this prophetic heads up about what is to come? Well, that's turning us to point number 5 of my sermon this morning and sending us back to verse 4 in our passage. I said that I thought the main takeaway was there in verse 4, in that second heavenly announcement. You see it there. Come out of her, my people, lest you take part in her sins, lest you share in her plagues. Participating in her sins and all that has been spoken as a verdict against Babylon throughout this passage. There's the warning to don't participate in that. And don't participate with her on the day of judgment when that judgment comes. You don't want to be there. So what should you do, people of God, people of Christ? Well, come out of her. I want to finish our time this morning by considering why Christians ought to separate from the world and what that might look like. Insofar as we join with sinners in their disordered and rebellious lives and systems, we take part in their sins. We cannot disconnect from sinners in this world, nor should we aim to do so. But we ought to separate ourselves in meaningful and practical and effective ways. The Bible teaches us this all over the place. 2 Corinthians chapter 6 says to be careful not to join in with sinners, but to strive for holiness in our thoughts and our words and our deeds. Christians are to live peculiar lives, marked with holiness, marked with obedience, marked with love, first and foremost for one another and also for even our enemies. In fact, 1 Peter chapter 4 tells us this, with the view of the end in sight. Peter says, live for the rest of the time until Christ returns, in the flesh, no longer for human passions, but for the will of God. In other words, the call for Christians is to learn what God commands, to understand what God forbids, and to live accordingly. Don't live for human passions, just chasing after whatever it is that climbs up in you as your desires, but understand what has God commanded, what has He said is off limits, and set our lives in accordance with His instructions. Peter goes on to say, 1 Peter chapter 4, the end of all things is at hand. Therefore, be self-controlled and sober-minded. Keep loving one another earnestly. Show hospitality to one another and serve one another as good stewards of God's varied graces. In other words, the call for Christians is to live in real relationship with other believers and to give ourselves for the good of others. This is what we do with the time we have. We aim to live our lives ordered according to God's good design, God's good intention, God's good instructions. We don't live as the world lives. We don't join in with the world in its disordered living, but we live differently. We bear witness to Christ in the way we live, even as Babylon continues in its sinful trajectory. So some questions that we might ask. If you are a new believer, a young Christian, especially young men and women, how are you cultivating the courage to live differently than many of your peers? How are you doing that? If Babylon is so enticing, if we are so inclined towards sin and rebellion against God, how are you cultivating the courage to live differently from your peers? Are you spending all of your efforts on pursuing the American dream or chasing the next pleasure or defending all of your leisure time? Is that what you do? Or are you reading and learning and thinking about God's good designs and intentions for your life? Is this where you invest your time? Are you spending time with older Christians who model Christian living well? Are you learning about the heritage of faith that you have inherited from the Christians who've lived before you? If you're a young Christian, are you putting into practice the disciplines of Christian growth and godly living like Bible reading and prayer and accountability and fellowship and the whole structure of ordered Christian living? How are you investing your time? What is it you're prioritizing? If you're an older Christian, you might think like this. How are you budgeting your time and your treasure to invest well in those Christians who are coming up after you? Are you spending all of your efforts on building a bigger earthly kingdom of your own, or pursuing leisure as the highest reward, or fighting the latest social media battle, or mindlessly scrolling on your phone, or watching television, filling your head with all sorts of worldly passions? Is that how you're spending your time and effort? Or are you inviting younger and newer Christians into your life? Are you helping younger or newer Christians to understand what it looks like to order their lives according to God's good design and intentions? Are you making use of your time, your money, to help sinners come to know and follow Christ, to help newer Christians mature in the faith, to ensure that there will be a strong generation of faithful believers who will come along behind you and carry the torch long after you're gone? Friends, the kingdoms of this earth will soon face swift and complete judgment from God. So we ought to separate ourselves by living faithfully for Christ in anticipation of that coming day. May God help us to live like Christians who know that all the precious things that seem so wonderful and powerful and enticing in this world, that they will soon come to an end. That we might loosen our grip on this world and take tighter grip on the world to come, and help others to do that very same thing around us. May God help us to do that. Would you bow with me?
We trust that this message edified the listener and glorified the God who shows love and mercy to sinners in the person and work of Jesus Christ, his Son. Would you take a moment to leave a positive rating for us on your podcast app? You'll be helping others find this episode and more like it. If you'd like more information about First Baptist Diana, then please visit our website, www.fbcdiana.org.